So I'm very pleased and honoured now to introduce Professor Paul Bacon. He is on the Faculty of International Research and Education at Waseda University in Japan.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being here.
No, not at all. Thanks for asking me.
Thanks. So I just was really interested to follow up on some of your points from the workshop.
Okay.
First of all, what stood out for me was that Japan seems to be the most concerned about the British referendum, and I was wondering, why do you think that is the case?
Well, I think because they've got an awful lot invested. The trade relationship is worth a lot in both directions. You've also got a situation where Japan uses the UK as a kind of offshore base for all of its operations. It has a very sort of distinctive philosophy of basing its operations in the UK precisely because it's in the single market and then being able to trade on. So, for example, Nissan sells 55% of the cars that it produces in the UK on the continental market. For Toyota, the figure is 75%. It's even higher. So the entire Japanese model for engaging with the EU is at stake under Brexit. So that's one of the main reasons why it's so important.
So you think it's going to have to rethink its whole method of trade within Europe?
Well, I mean, I'm not an economist,
No.
but I mean, one of the other important things I think in the statements, like both Nissan and Toyota made quite high-profile statements for the short term, they would continue with their production bases in the UK. But if you read those documents carefully, there were coded warnings that in the medium to long term, if the business conditions and the nature and extent of the Brexit turned against Japanese business interests, then they would have no hesitation in moving. So a lot of the people who are pro-Brexit simply focused on the fact that they were staying. They didn't read, or they didn't want to read, or they didn't want to advertise the small print, where the Japanese made it reasonably clear that they would have no reservations whatsoever about relocating if it proves to be necessary.
Yeah.
Do you mind if we can, because I'm getting a bit of side noise from the...
Yeah.
Sorry, it's a bit... Yeah. Come on.
And you've got a British accent, I believe.
Sort of, yeah, I suppose, yeah.
Do you think, though, within Britain, they've thought about the potential negative impacts that this might have on their relations with third countries outside of Europe, for example, Japan?
I have to be careful what I say on record, I think, but I think there's an awful lot of people with very strong opinions on Brexit that don't really know so much about how the EU operates itself, what the UK stands to lose, let alone something even more indirect and abstract to them, like the impact that it would have on someone as far away as Japan. So no, I think awareness and understanding of this kind of issue is extremely low.
And the other thing I wanted to follow up with you today is that you mentioned that Japan took a very unusual step for Japan, and it sent a message to the UK and the European Union. I was just wondering, could you expand more about what that meant for Japan,
sure.
And what was in the contents of that message?
Sure. Well, I mentioned it briefly in the lecture, in the round table, because we were under quite significant time constraints. But if I can just crib that the technical name for this diplomatic statement, this diplomatic communication, was the message to the UK and to the EU. And so the timing and the location of the announcement was very, very interesting, and the content was very interesting. So the document was 15 pages of quite closely argued sort of technical specifications and requirements about continued UK access to the single market. There were 18 concrete points of advice for both the UK and the EU. So it was a very strongly worded diplomatic communique, strictly speaking, and a not very coded appeal for a soft Brexit, and also which maintains existing UK levels of market access. Now, it seems with Prime Minister May's speech yesterday that we're not going to get a soft Brexit, that we're going to get, at best, a grey Brexit, where there may or may not be selective access to the free market for sectors where the EU and the UK will be able to agree. So, to that extent, I think, Japan's interests, the interest that Japan expressed in this diplomatic memorandum, will not be reflected in the Brexit. So I think that's a significant problem that Japan will have to address, and also in turn that the UK will have to address. So it's very unusual for any country, especially sort of two major countries, to issue such public sort of communiques to each other in such a way. But it's extraordinary for Japan to do such a thing, because culturally it's all about sort of backstairs communication, low-level communication, communication between the words. So if you know a little bit more about the Japanese diplomatic context, this is an extraordinary document and an extraordinary statement. It was also made sort of around the G20 summit, which was held in China, so it was a deliberate attempt to embarrass Theresa May and embarrass the Chinese on a very public scale as well. So it's a very, just any diplomatic context, it's a very significant move, but for Japan to do this is highly, highly significant.
Sure, and thank you very much for your time today.
My pleasure.